In the somber twilight of a late autumn evening, Claire Everson stood before the weathered gates of Stillridge, her ancestral hometown. The rusted iron creaked ominously as she pushed them open, a sound that seemed to echo through the hollow chambers of her soul. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves and something else, something older and more sinister that she couldn't quite place. Claire clutched the worn envelope containing her grandmother's will, the paper now creased and soft from the countless times she had unfolded and refolded it during her journey. The lawyer's words still rang in her ears. As the last living Everson, you are hereby bequeathed the family estate in Stillridge, including all lands and properties therein. She had left this place as a child, in the wake of her parents' mysterious deaths. Now, at 32, Claire found herself drawn back by the inexorable pull of inheritance and the weight of unresolved history. The town seemed smaller than she remembered, the buildings hunched and tired as if bearing the weight of countless untold secrets. As Claire made her way down the town's main street, she felt the eyes of the locals upon her. Their gazes were a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and something that bordered on pity. An old man sitting on a bench outside the general store spat on the ground as she passed, muttering something under his breath that sounded like Everson witch. The farmhouse loomed before her at last, a decrepit Victorian structure that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. The paint was peeling, the windows clouded with grime, and the porch steps groaned in protest as Claire ascended them. She fumbled with the ancient key, its brass surface cool against her skin, before finally managing to unlock the door. The interior of the house was a time capsule, frozen in the moment her grandmother had last walked these halls. Dust motes danced in the fading light that filtered through the grimy windows, and the air was heavy with the musty scent of abandonment and decay. Claire's footsteps echoed through the empty rooms as she explored, each creak of the floorboards sending a shiver down her spine. In the kitchen, she found a note pinned to the refrigerator, the paper yellowed with age. Her grandmother's spidery handwriting was barely legible. Claire, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and the burden has fallen to you. I'm sorry, my dear, I tried to break it, to end it all, but the whispers, they never stop. The field hungers. Be careful. Don't go near it after dark. Grandma Evelyn. Claire frowned, puzzling over the cryptic message. What field? What whispers? She shook her head, attributing the note to the ramblings of an old woman who had lived alone for far too long. As night fell, Claire settled into one of the dusty bedrooms, too exhausted from her journey to bother with cleaning. She drifted off to sleep, lulled by the soft creaking of the old house settling around her. In her dreams, she stood in a vast field of tall grass, swaying gently in a breeze she couldn't feel. The sky above was a roiling mass of dark clouds, occasionally lit from within by flashes of silent lightning. And then she heard them. Whispers. Countless voices carried on the wind, unintelligible yet somehow familiar. Claire woke with a start, her heart pounding. The room was pitch black, the silence absolute. And then, carried on the night air, she heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, speaking a single word. Claire. She bolted upright, fumbling for the lamp on the bedside table. As light flooded the room, the whisper faded, leaving her to wonder if it had been real or merely an echo of her dream. The next morning, Claire ventured into town, determined to learn more about her family's history in Stillridge. The locals were tight-lipped, offering only curt nods or mumbled greetings as she passed. It wasn't until she entered the small library that she found someone willing to speak to her. The librarian, a wizened old woman with thick glasses and gnarled hands, peered at Claire over the rims of her spectacles. "You're Evelyn's granddaughter," she said. It wasn't a question. Claire nodded. "I've inherited the farmhouse. I was hoping to learn more about my family's history here." The old woman's eyes narrowed. "Some histories are best left buried, child. But if you must know..." She disappeared into the stacks, returning moments later with a dusty tome. This is a record of Stillridge's founding families. The Eversons feature prominently. As Claire pored over the book, a pattern began to emerge. The Eversons had been among the first settlers of Stillridge, and for generations, they had been the most prosperous farmers in the region. But there was something else, a dark, undercurrent that ran through the family's history. Every generation, it seemed, was marked by tragedy, unexplained deaths, disappearances, madness. Claire's head was spinning as she left the library, the weight of her family's troubled past settling heavily on her shoulders. As she walked back towards the farmhouse, she noticed for the first time the vast expanse of overgrown land that bordered her property, the field her grandmother had mentioned in her note. Even in the bright light of day, there was something unsettling about it. The grass seemed too tall, too dense, moving in ways that didn't quite match the breeze. And at the edges of her hearing, Claire could have sworn she heard something. Whispers, perhaps, or the faintest echo of distant voices. That night, as Claire sat in the farmhouse's musty living room, poring over old family albums and letters she had found in the attic, the whispers came again. This time, there was no mistaking them for the wind or her imagination. They seemed to seep through the walls, a cacophony of indistinct voices all calling her name. "Claire, Claire, join us, Claire." Heart pounding, she rushed to the window. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the field. And there, at the edge of the tall grass, she saw them, shadowy figures, barely more substantial than the mist that clung to the ground. They swayed gently as if moved by some unfelt breeze, their arms outstretched towards the house. Towards her. Claire stumbled back from the window, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sort of hallucination, a product of stress and an overactive imagination. But deep down, she knew the truth. The whispers were real. The figures in the field were real. And somehow she knew they were tied to the dark legacy of the Everson family. As dawn broke, Claire found herself sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by piles of old letters and journals. She had spent the night diving deep into her family's history, and what she had uncovered chilled her to the bone. The Eversons, it seemed, had not come by their prosperity honestly. In the early days of Stillridge, when drought and famine threatened to destroy the fledgling settlement, Jeremiah Everson, Claire's many times great-grandfather, had made a pact. The details were vague, cloaked in euphemism and cryptic references, but the gist was clear. Jeremiah had promised something to the land itself, some sort of regular tribute, in exchange for bountiful harvests. For generations, the Eversons had honored this pact, and their fields had flourished while others withered. But the price was high. Every generation, one Everson would be claimed by the land, vanishing into the field that now bordered Claire's property. Those who tried to escape this fate inevitably met with tragedy, accidents, madness, or a wasting sickness that defied medical explanation. Claire's own parents had tried to break the cycle. They had fled Stillridge when Claire was just a child, vowing never to return. But the land's reach was long, and less than a year later they were dead, victims of a car accident on a clear, straight road with no other vehicles involved. Now, as the last living Everson, the weight of this cursed legacy had fallen to Claire. The whispers in the field were growing louder, more insistent. They were calling her, demanding the tribute that her family had sworn to provide so long ago. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Claire made a decision. She couldn't run, couldn't hide from this. Whatever dark force dwelled in that field, whatever her ancestors had awakened, she had to face it. She had to find a way to end this curse, once and for all. With trembling hands, she penned a letter, detailing everything she had discovered. If something happened to her, at least the truth would be known. Then, steeling her nerves, Claire Everson stepped out of the farmhouse and began walking towards the field that had haunted her family for generations. The tall grass swayed before her, seeming to beckon her closer. The whispers grew louder with each step, a chorus of ghostly voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome home, Claire," they seemed to say. "We've been waiting for you." As she stepped into the field, the grass closed around her like a living thing. The world beyond disappeared, replaced by an endless sea of swaying stalks under a sky that seemed somehow wrong, too close, too dark, despite the morning sun that should have been shining. Claire pushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The voices surrounded her now, some pleading, some threatening, all demanding that she give herself to the field as her ancestors had done. But she refused to succumb. She was here to end this, not to become another sacrifice to whatever dark entity her family had awakened. Time seemed to lose all meaning as she trudged through the grass. It could have been minutes or hours later when Claire finally reached a clearing in the center of the field. Here the ground was bare and black, as if nothing had grown there for centuries. In the center stood a crude stone altar, ancient and worn, covered in symbols that made Claire's eyes hurt to look at directly. As she approached the altar, the whispers rose to a fever pitch. The air around her seemed to thicken and darken, taking on an almost liquid quality. And from this darkness, figures began to emerge, translucent, ghostly shapes that Claire recognized from old family photographs. Her ancestors, those who had been claimed by the field, now trapped for eternity in this liminal space. They surrounded her, their voices a cacophony of pleas and warnings. Some begged her to run to save herself. Others demanded that she complete the ritual, to offer herself to the land as they had done. Through it all, Claire stood firm, her gaze fixed on the altar before her. She could feel something stirring beneath the earth, something ancient and hungry awakening at her presence. The ground began to tremble, and cracks appeared in the barren soil, oozing a thick black substance that looked more like oil than blood. Claire knew with a certainty that transcended rational thought that she stood on the precipice of a moment that would define not just her fate, but the fate of her entire lineage. The curse that had plagued the Eversons for generations could end here, with her, but the price would be high. As the entity that dwelled within the field began to manifest, a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to devour the very light around it, Claire made her choice. She would not run, would not hide, would not offer herself as a sacrifice to continue this cycle of horror. Instead, she began to speak, her voice rising above the whispers and the howling wind that had sprung up around her. She spoke of her family's guilt, of the weight of generations of sin. She spoke of the innocent lives claimed by their pact, of the suffering they had caused in their quest for prosperity. And as she spoke, she felt something shift in the air around her. The darkness receded ever so slightly. The whispers faltered. For the first time in centuries, the entity that dwelled within the field faced not a terrified victim, but someone willing to stand against it. Claire's words became a litany, a challenge to the very foundations of the curse that bound her family to this land. She offered not her life, but her defiance. She stood not as a sacrifice, but as a reckoning. The world around her began to warp and twist, reality itself seeming to bend under the weight of the confrontation. Claire felt as if she were being torn apart and remade with each passing moment. Her very essence stretched to its breaking point, and still she stood firm. As the first part of our tale draws to a close, we leave Claire Everson locked in a battle of wills with an entity beyond human comprehension, the fate of her family, and perhaps the town of Stillridge itself, hanging in the balance. The field roils around her, a maelstrom of supernatural energies and centuries-old guilt. The outcome of this confrontation remains uncertain, the balance between curse and salvation, as precarious as a razor's edge. But one thing is clear: the quiet, unassuming woman who had returned to Stillridge to simply sell an inherited property has set in motion events that will reshape the very fabric of reality in this small, haunted corner of the world. The whispers in the field have met their match in Claire Everson, and the night is far from over. The world around Claire Everson twisted and warped, reality itself seeming to bend under the weight of her confrontation with the entity that dwelled within the field. The cacophony of whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, 1,000 voices begging, threatening, pleading for her to give herself to the insatiable hunger that had claimed so many of her ancestors. But Claire stood firm, her defiance a beacon in the maelstrom of supernatural energies that swirled around her. She continued to speak, her words a litany of guilt and responsibility, of the weight of generations of sin that her family had accrued. With each syllable, she felt something shift in the air around her, as if the very fabric of the curse was unraveling. The entity, that formless mass of darkness and hunger, recoiled from her words. For the first time in centuries, it faced not a terrified victim, but a force of reckoning. Claire could feel its confusion, its uncertainty in the face of her refusal to submit. As dawn broke over the field, casting long shadows through the writhing grass, Claire felt a sudden searing pain in her chest. She gasped, stumbling backwards, her hand clutching at her heart. For a moment, she feared that the entity had struck a fatal blow, that her defiance had come at the ultimate cost. But as the pain subsided, she realized that something fundamental had changed. The oppressive weight of the curse, the constant pressure she had felt since setting foot in Stillridge, had lifted. The whispers, while not entirely gone, had receded to a distant murmur, barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the grass. Claire staggered back towards the farmhouse, her mind reeling from the confrontation. As she approached, she saw Jacob standing on the porch, his weathered face a mask of concern and awe. "By all that's holy," he breathed as she drew near. "You faced it, you actually faced it." Claire nodded wearily, too exhausted to speak. Jacob helped her into the house, his gnarled hands surprisingly gentle as he guided her to a chair in the kitchen. As he busied himself making tea, Claire tried to process what had just happened. She had confronted the entity, had stood against the force that had terrorized her family for generations. And while she hadn't destroyed it, she understood now that such a being could never truly be destroyed. She had changed something. The balance had shifted. As Jacob set a steaming mug of tea before her, Claire finally found her voice. "It's not over," she said, her words barely above a whisper. "But something's different now. I can feel it." The old farmer nodded solemnly. "Your grandmother, she always said that the curse could be broken, that it would take someone with the strength to face the truth, to bear the weight of all that came before." He fixed Claire with a penetrating gaze. "I think she was waiting for you, Miss Claire, even if she didn't know it." Over the next few days, Claire delved deeper into her family's history. She pored over old journals and letters, piecing together the full story of the Everson curse. The tale that emerged was one of desperation and dark bargains, of a family bound to an ancient hungry entity by a pact made in a time of great need. Jeremiah Everson, her many times great-grandfather, had been the one to make the initial deal. Facing starvation and the failure of his fledgling settlement, he had performed a ritual in an ancient stone circle deep in the woods. He had offered his blood to the land, promising regular tribute in exchange for prosperity. But the entity he had awakened was far older and more terrible than anything Jeremiah could have imagined. It was a thing of primal hunger, a force that had slumbered beneath the earth since long before humans walked upon it. And now that it was awake, it would not easily be satiated. For generations, the Eversons had paid the price for Jeremiah's bargain. The entity demanded a sacrifice from each generation, a life given to the field, consumed by the hungry earth. Those who tried to escape this fate inevitably met with tragedy, as Claire's own parents had discovered. As she read, Claire began to see patterns emerging. The entity's power seemed to wax and wane with the seasons, reaching its peak at the autumn equinox. And there were hints, scattered throughout the family records, of ways to resist its influence. Certain herbs and minerals that could ward off the whispers, rituals that could provide temporary protection. But most intriguing of all were the final entries in her grandmother's journal. Evelyn Everson had spent years researching the entity, delving into ancient texts and obscure folklore. She had come to believe that the curse could be broken, but the cost would be enormous. It would require a willing sacrifice, someone of Everson blood who could channel the power of their entire lineage to bind the entity once more. As Claire closed the journal, her mind reeling from all she had learned, she became aware of a change in the air. The relative quiet that had fallen over Stillridge in the wake of her confrontation was lifting, replaced by a low, insistent hum. And beneath that hum she could hear them again, the whispers, growing stronger with each passing moment. "It's starting again," Jacob said, his voice tight with fear. "The field and its calling." Claire moved to the window, dreading what she might see. The fog that had blanketed the field was roiling now, shot through with veins of sickly green light. And at the edge of the tall grass she could see them, the shadowy figures of her ancestors, more substantial now than they had been before, their arms outstretched in supplication or warning. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Till the equinox." Jacob shook his head. 3 days, maybe 4. It's hard to say for sure. Time gets strange. when the field is active like this. Claire nodded, her jaw set with determination. Then we have work to do. The next few days passed in a blur of feverish activity. Claire threw herself into preparations, drawing upon every scrap of knowledge she could glean from the family records and from Jacob's lifetime of experience with the town's dark secret. She gathered herbs from the overgrown garden behind the farmhouse, rosemary for protection, St. John's wort to ward off evil influences, mugwort to enhance psychic awareness. Under Jacob's guidance, she learned to fashion crude talismans from iron nails and red thread, ancient symbols of warding that had been used in the region for centuries. All the while, the presence of the field grew stronger. The whispers were a constant now, a maddening susurration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Claire found herself humming constantly, singing snatches of half-remembered songs, anything to drown out the insidious voices that threatened to overwhelm her sanity. As the equinox drew near, other changes became apparent. The sky took on a sickly greenish tinge, and animals fled the area in droves. Birds fell from the sky, their bodies twisted and malformed as if they had been exposed to some terrible, mutating force. And in town, people began to vanish. It started with the drifters and loners, those on the fringes of Stillridge society. But soon, even respected members of the community were disappearing, leaving behind only empty homes and baffled, terrified families. Claire knew with a dreadful certainty that they were being drawn into the field, fuel for the entity's growing power. On the eve of the equinox, Claire and Jacob made their final preparations. They had turned the farmhouse into a fortress of sorts, every window and door lined with protective herbs and sigils. But both of them knew that these defenses were, at best, a temporary measure. The true battle was yet to come. As night fell, the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The constant background noise of crickets and nightbirds fell silent, replaced by an oppressive stillness that seemed to press in on the farmhouse from all sides. And then, just as the old grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, it began. The ground trembled, a deep subsonic rumble that Claire felt in her bones rather than heard. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on an oily, iridescent sheen. And from the direction of the field came a sound that defied description, a vast, hungry roar that seemed to contain within it the screams of countless tormented souls. Claire stumbled to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The field was changing. The tall grass writhed and twisted, taking on forms that hurt the eye to look upon. The shadowy figures that had haunted its edges were fully corporeal now, shambling towards the farmhouse with a terrible purpose. And at the center of it all, rising from the earth like some vast primordial beast, was the entity itself. It was a thing of roiling darkness and sickly phosphorescent light, its form constantly shifting and changing. Tendrils of inky blackness reached out from its amorphous body, grasping at the air with hungry purpose. "Oh God," Jacob breathed, his face ashen. "It's fully awake, we're too late." But Claire shook her head, a strange calm settling over her. "No," she said. "This is how it has to be. The entity has to manifest fully if we're to have any hope of binding it." She turned to the old farmer, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "Jacob, I need you to stay here. Keep the defenses strong. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, don't let anything into the house." "But Miss Claire," he protested, "you can't go out there alone, it'll kill you." Claire managed a grim smile. "Maybe," she said, "but I'm an Everson. This is my legacy, my responsibility. And I'm the only one who has a chance of ending this once and for all." Before Jacob could argue further, Claire was moving. She grabbed the satchel she had prepared, filled with herbs and talismans, and the journal that held the secrets of her family's curse. Then, taking a deep breath to steel herself, she stepped out onto the porch. The moment she crossed the threshold, the full force of the entity's power hit her like a physical blow. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, 1,000 voices begging, threatening, pleading for her to give herself to the field. The air itself seemed to press in on her, as if the very fabric of reality was warping under the entity's influence. But Claire stood firm. She began to walk towards the field, each step a monumental effort of will. The shadowy figures of her ancestors reached for her, their faces twisted in anguish or hunger. She couldn't tell which. She forced herself to look at them, to acknowledge the weight of generations of suffering that had led to this moment. As she neared the edge of the field, the entity seemed to notice her. Its vast, unknowable attention focused on her, and Claire felt as if her very soul was being flayed open and examined. In that moment, she understood with perfect clarity what she was facing. A being so ancient, so alien that human minds could barely comprehend its existence, but she also saw something else. A flicker of, not fear exactly, but uncertainty. The entity had grown used to the Eversons submitting, to accepting their role as sacrifices to its insatiable hunger. Claire's defiance, her willingness to confront it directly, was something new, something it didn't quite know how to handle. Taking advantage of that momentary hesitation, Claire began the ritual she had pieced together from her grandmother's notes and her own intuition. She spoke words in a language she didn't understand, her voice growing stronger with each syllable. She scattered herbs in a circle around her, their pungent scent cutting through the miasma of otherworldly energy that permeated the air. The entity reacted violently. Tendrils of darkness lashed out at her, only to be repelled by the protective circle. The ground beneath her feet bucked and heaved, nearly throwing her off balance. And the whispers became a howling gale of sound, threatening to drive her to her knees with their intensity. But still Claire persisted. She could feel something building within her, a power that came not just from her own will, but from the collective strength of every Everson who had come before her. In that moment, she was not just Claire. She was the avatar of her entire lineage, channeling centuries of guilt and fear and desperate hope into one final, world-altering act. As the ritual reached its climax, Claire felt as if she were being torn apart at the atomic level. Every cell in her body screamed in agony as she channeled more power than any human was meant to contain. The entity thrashed and roared, its form fluctuating wildly as it fought against the binding magic. And then, with a sound like the universe itself tearing in two, something shifted. The field seemed to implode, reality collapsing in on itself in a dizzying display of impossible geometries. Claire felt herself falling, tumbling through layers of existence she had never known existed. She saw glimpses of other worlds, other times, other possibilities, an infinite tapestry of realities, all connected by the gossamer threads of chance and choice. And at the center of it all was the entity, no longer a thing of terror and hunger, but something diminished, bound, not destroyed. Claire understood now that such a being could never truly be destroyed, but contained, sealed away in a prison of magic and will. As suddenly as it had begun, the maelstrom of cosmic energy subsided. Claire found herself lying on her back in the field, staring up at a sky that was once again a normal, star-studded expanse. The oppressive presence that had haunted Stillridge for generations was gone, leaving behind only a profound, almost deafening silence. Slowly, painfully, Claire pushed herself to her feet. The field around her was changed. The unnaturally tall grass was gone, replaced by a meadow of wildflowers that swayed gently in a breeze she could actually feel. And there, at the center of it all, stood the old stone altar. But it too was transformed, the eldritch symbols replaced by a simple inscription. Here lies the burden of the Eversons, at last laid to rest. As Claire staggered back towards the farmhouse, she felt a profound sense of release. The weight that had pressed down on her since she first set foot in Stillridge was gone. The whispers were silent. The curse was broken. But as she neared the house, seeing Jacob's awestruck face peering out from behind hastily removed wards, Claire knew that her work was not yet done. The entity might be bound, but the legacy of what her family had done, the lives lost, the suffering caused, remained. It would be her task now to make amends, to help heal the wounds that generations of Eversons had inflicted on this land and its people. As the first rays of dawn broke over Stillridge, Claire Everson stood on the porch of her ancestral home, looking out over a town that was, for the first time in centuries, truly free. The whispers in the field were gone, replaced by the simple, beautiful sounds of a world awakening to a new day. But even as she basked in the warmth of that hard-won victory, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that this was not truly an ending, but a beginning. The entity was bound, yes, but for how long? And what other secrets, what other horrors, might be lurking in the dark corners of the world, waiting for someone with the strength and the will to confront them? As these thoughts swirled in her mind, Claire made a decision. She would not run from this legacy, this responsibility. Instead, she would embrace it. She would use the knowledge she had gained, the power she had discovered within herself, to seek out other dark corners of the world, to confront the horrors that lurked in the shadows, and to bring light to places long lost to darkness. With a deep breath, Claire turned and walked back into the farmhouse. There was work to be done, preparations to be made. Her journey, she realized, was only just beginning. And somewhere in the depths of the binding she had created, in the space between worlds where such entities dwelled, something stirred. The whispers may have been silenced, but the hunger remained, waiting, watching, biding its time. For in Stillridge, as in all places touched by forces beyond mortal comprehension, the line between victory and defeat, between salvation and damnation, was as thin and fragile as a blade of grass in the whispering field. The days following Claire's confrontation with the entity in the field were marked by an eerie calm that settled over Stillridge. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the town for generations seemed to have lifted, replaced by a tentative sense of hope. But for Claire Everson, the battle was far from over. As she stood on the porch of her ancestral home, watching the sun rise over the now peaceful field, Claire knew that her work was just beginning. The entity might be bound, but the wounds it had inflicted on this land and its people ran deep. Healing would take time, and vigilance. "What now, Miss Claire?" Jacob's weathered voice broke through her reverie. The old farmer had become her staunchest ally in the fight against the curse, and now he looked to her for guidance. Claire turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of determination and weariness. "Now, we start to make things right," she said. "There's so much damage to undo, so many secrets to uncover." Over the next few weeks, Claire threw herself into the task of unraveling the full extent of her family's dark legacy. She pored over old town records, spoke with elderly residents who remembered the whispers of past tragedies, and explored every inch of the Everson property, searching for clues. What she uncovered was both heartbreaking and infuriating. The prosperity that the Eversons had enjoyed for generations had come at a terrible cost, not just to their own family, but to the entire town. The entity's influence had seeped into every aspect of Stillridge's history, warping lives and twisting fates. Claire learned of other families who had suffered inexplicable tragedies, of crops that had flourished while neighboring farms withered, of strange disappearances that had been quietly swept under the rug. The Everson curse had cast a long shadow, and its tendrils reached further than she had ever imagined. As she delved deeper into these dark secrets, Claire began to experience strange dreams. Night after night, she found herself wandering through a twisted version of Stillridge, where the buildings were made of writhing shadows and the streets were paved with whispers. In these dreams, she would encounter the spectral forms of her ancestors, their faces twisted with guilt and sorrow. One figure appeared more frequently than the others, a woman with long silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. Claire recognized her from old photographs as her great-grandmother, Eliza Everson. In the dreams, Eliza would reach out to Claire, her lips moving in silent speech, trying to convey some urgent message. Claire woke from these dreams feeling drained, as if she had been running for miles. But each morning she would find herself with new insights, new understandings of the curse and its workings. It was as if Eliza was guiding her from beyond the grave, sharing knowledge that had been lost to time. As Claire worked to uncover the truth, strange occurrences began to plague Stillridge. The weather became erratic, with sudden storms appearing out of clear skies. Animals behaved oddly, birds flying in unnatural patterns, and dogs howling at unseen threats. And most disturbing of all, people began to report hearing whispers again, faint but unmistakable. "It's not over, is it?" Jacob asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching another unnatural storm roll in. The entity, It's trying to break free. Claire nodded grimly. I think you're right. What I did in the field, it was a binding, not a banishment. The entity is weakened but not destroyed, and now it's fighting back. She stood, her face set with determination. We need to finish this, Jacob, once and for all. Over the next few days, Claire redoubled her efforts. She reached out to experts in occult lore, poring over ancient texts and obscure manuscripts. She traveled to neighboring towns, seeking out others who had encountered similar entities, gathering every scrap of knowledge she could find. And all the while, the pressure grew. The whispers in the field became louder, more insistent. The storms grew more violent, the animal behavior more erratic. Claire could feel the entity straining against the bonds she had placed on it, growing stronger with each passing day. It all came to a head on a moonless night in late autumn. Claire had just returned from a trip to a nearby university library, her mind reeling from the revelations she had uncovered in a set of ancient Scandinavian texts. As she approached the farmhouse, she saw Jacob running towards her, his face pale with fear. "Miss Claire," he gasped, "the field, you need to see this." Claire followed him to the edge of the property, her heart pounding in her chest. What she saw made her blood run cold. The field was moving. The grass writhed and twisted as if alive, and strange lights pulsed beneath the surface of the earth. And rising from the center of it all was a column of darkness that seemed to drink in the very light around it. "It's breaking free," Claire whispered, her voice filled with dread. "We're out of time." She turned to Jacob, her eyes blazing with sudden purpose. "Get everyone out of town," she ordered. "As many as you can. Tell them anything. Just get them to safety." "But what about you?" Jacob protested. Claire managed a grim smile. "I'm going to finish what my ancestors started. I'm going to end this once and for all." Before Jacob could argue further, Claire was already moving. She ran back to the house, gathering the tools and talismans she had prepared for this moment. As she worked, she could feel the entity's power growing, the very air around her thick with malevolent energy. When she stepped back outside, the world had changed. The sky was a roiling mass of unnatural colors, and the wind howled with the voices of 1,000 lost souls. The column of darkness from the field had grown, reaching towards the heavens like some terrible, inverse Tower of Babel. Claire began to walk towards the field, each step a battle against the forces that sought to drive her back. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, begging, threatening, pleading for her to turn back. But Claire pressed on, her jaw set with grim determination. As she reached the edge of the field, she began the ritual she had pieced together from her research and the dream visions of her great-grandmother. She spoke words in languages long dead, her voice rising above the howling wind. She drew symbols in the air with herbs and sacred oils, each gesture a defiance against the darkness that sought to consume her. The entity fought back with all its might. Tendrils of shadow lashed out at Claire, seeking to rend her flesh and shatter her will. The ground beneath her feet bucked and heaved, threatening to swallow her whole. And the whispers became a psychic assault that threatened to shred her very sanity. But Claire stood firm. She drew upon the strength of her ancestors, upon the power of the land itself. She channeled the guilt and fear and desperate hope of generations of Eversons into one final, world-altering act. As the ritual reached its climax, Claire felt something fundamental shift in the fabric of reality. The column of darkness before her began to warp and twist, collapsing in on itself like a dying star. The entity's howls of rage and despair echoed across dimensions, a sound that would haunt Claire's dreams for years to come. And then, with a sound like the universe itself exhaling, it was over. The unnatural storm dissipated, leaving behind a sky full of peaceful stars. The writhing grass in the field stilled, then began to wither and die, revealing rich black soil beneath. And the whispers that had tormented Stillridge for generations, fell silent. Claire collapsed to her knees, exhausted beyond measure. She could feel the changes rippling out from the field, spreading across Stillridge and beyond. The curse was broken, truly and finally. The entity was not destroyed. Such a being could never be truly annihilated, but it was banished, cast into a void from which it could never return. As dawn broke over Stillridge, Claire Everson stood on shaky legs and began the long walk back to the farmhouse. She knew that her work was not yet done. There would be explanations to give, amends to make, a town to help heal. But for the first time since she had returned to her ancestral home, she felt a sense of true hope. The legacy of the Eversons had been one of darkness and suffering for far too long. Now, Claire vowed, it would become one of healing and redemption. She would use the knowledge she had gained, the power she had discovered within herself, to help others who faced similar horrors. She would be a light in the darkness, a beacon of hope for those trapped in the shadows of the world. As she reached the porch of the old farmhouse, Claire turned to look back at the field one last time. Where once there had been a landscape of nightmares, she now saw the promise of new growth, of a future unshackled from the sins of the past. The whispering field was silent at last, its hungry god banished to the outer darkness. But in that silence, Claire heard the whisper of a new beginning, a promise of redemption, not just for her family, but for all those touched by the long shadow of the curse. With a deep breath, Claire Everson turned and walked into her ancestral home. There was work to be done, a new chapter to be written, and she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that she had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. As she crossed the threshold, a gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth and new possibilities. And in that breeze, so faint that it might have been imagination, Claire thought she heard a whisper, not of hunger or despair, but of gratitude and release. The curse of the Eversons was broken. The whispering field was silent. And in Stillridge, for the first time in centuries, the future stretched out bright and full of promise, unmarred by the shadows of the past.